Have you ever wished there was like a master cheat sheet for art? A single, definitive map that traces the entire timeline an artist takes from their very first messy pencil stroke all the way to complex painting philosophies. Well, today we are decoding exactly that. We're embarking on a visual journey through an incredibly fascinating handwritten document that breaks down the absolute fundamentals of visual art. We're going to trace this timeline step by step. We'll see how raw observation evolves into drawing, splinters into abstract concepts, and eventually flows right onto the painter's canvas. Let's jump in.
So let's take a look at our source material. It's this incredibly dense, completely handwritten document. Honestly, it's essentially an entire art school curriculum condensed onto a single textured page. It maps out the artistic process perfectly, physically dividing the world of dry drawing techniques from the world of wet painting styles, all while giving us this really clear narrative of an artist's development over time.
And here is our roadmap to unpack this whole list. Number 1, foundations of observation. 2, drawing mediums and techniques. 3, abstract and experimental styles. 4, core painting mediums. And finally, 5, realism to post-impressionism.
All right, starting right at the beginning. Section 1, Foundations of Observation. Because, look, before you ever pick up a brush, before you even worry about making a good picture, you just have to learn how to see. Our document outlines 4 foundational observation and sketching techniques. It kicks off with blind contour and gesture drawing, which are these methods designed entirely to train your eye and your hand to work together. It's all about capturing raw form and rapid movement, usually without even looking down at your page. Then, as the artist gets a bit more control, they introduce cross-hatching and stippling to start pulling real texture and depth straight out of the blank white space.
And notice this specific 0 to 6 value scale sketch positioned right next to the observation list. It shows us exactly how to mathematically map out light and dark. The document specifically labels this the Flourmet shot value of drawing. It's an absolutely vital early step in the timeline. You know, learning to quantify light from pure white at 0 all the way to pitch black at a level 6.
Moving right along to Section 2, Drawing Mediums and Techniques.
So once an artist can observe, they really have to learn to control their tools. First up on the timeline are the forgiving, dusty mediums, graphite and charcoal. These tools are all about manipulating the material directly on the page itself. The list highlights blending, smudging, and erasing. At this stage, the artist is practically sculpting the drawing dust, right? Just pushing it around and lifting it off to create those value studies we were just talking about. This little sketch right next to the graphite list perfectly visualizes this concept. It shows how simple, directional diagonal hatching creates a real sense of three-dimensional volume in what would otherwise be a completely flat circle. You can practically see the graphite being laid down to build up that shadow.
But the timeline progresses. Moving away from the erasable, smudgy nature of charcoal, the artist graduates to ink and pen. And this requires a massive leap in precision. The document categorizes this into technical drawing and line art, highlighting the rigid control required alongside calligraphy and fluid ink wash techniques. There is absolutely no erasing here. Every single mark is a permanent commitment.
Just notice this tiny crosshatch sketch paired with the ink section. This shows exactly how pen and ink builds density. Since you literally can't just smudge ink with your thumb to create a soft shadow, you have to layer lines mathematically. You overlap them over and over to trick the eye into seeing darker values.
Which brings us to Section 3, Abstract and Experimental Styles.
Now, at this point in our journey, something really shifts. The artist has mastered basic observation and those dry tools. But now, our source document takes this fascinating and honestly kind of cryptic turn, away from strict representation and into the purely conceptual. Under abstract art, we see the recognizable historical movements listed, right? The geometric fracturing of cubism, the wild colors of Fauvism, the pure emotional intensity of expressionism. But if you look closely, it lists those right alongside highly unique, hyper-specific classifications, like this one written right here as Neo-Vicrelianism. It really shows the artist's journey branching out into some deeply personal conceptual territory.
And the timeline gets even more experimental from there. We've got this completely separate category just labeled Hatteras, and this section features deeply unusual, almost poetic terminology for styles. I mean, we're talking things like planing mean, meganic dross, martor and Colliuna screw, and martor and macula drawing. It brilliantly illustrates that part of mastering art is eventually inventing your own language and completely pushing the boundaries of what a drawing even is.
Okay, before we move further along our timeline, just notice how the document explicitly divides our journey. We have officially reached the border. We are transitioning out of the dry, foundational world of drawing styles and techniques at the top of the page and moving downwards into the fluid, colorful world of painting styles.
So let's explore Section 4, Core Painting Mediums. This is where the artist begins working with real color and liquid dynamics through acrylic, watercolor, and oil. The guide outlines very distinct behaviors for these paints. For acrylic, it heavily emphasizes blending. In fact, it actually lists it twice, along with the textured dry brush technique called scumbling. Watercolor, on the other hand, is defined by its fluid transparency. An artist's timeline with watercolor involves mastering the broad wash, the totally unpredictable bleeding of wet-on-wet application, and the subtractive technique of lifting color back off the wet paper.
And then we reach oil paint, the historical heavyweight. Now, oil techniques definitely share some DNA with watercolor, like lifting, but the document outlines its own specific methodologies too. We see glazing for those thin, transparent layers, sitting alongside methods written exactly here as impasting, which refers to super thick textured paint application, and specific wet blending techniques noted as scrumbel wet and wesh on wet.
And finally, Section 5, Realism to Post-Impressionism. So we've traced the timeline from raw sketching to complex paint application. But how are these tools actually used to define entire eras of art? Well, according to the document, the traditional pinnacle of the timeline is realism, or naturalism. This style is relentlessly focused on breathtakingly accurate representation. It employs strict academic drawing principles and goes as far as trompe l'oeil. If you don't know that term, it's French for art that is so incredibly realistic it literally creates an optical illusion, tricking your eye into thinking a painted object is a real, physical, three-dimensional thing.
But as we know, the timeline of art didn't just stop at perfect illusions. The document moves us next into Impressionism. This is defined entirely by stepping outside the stuffy academic studio. It relies heavily on working plein air, which just means painting outdoors, right there on location, and intentionally utilizing visible brushstrokes. So it's no longer about hiding the paint to trick the eye. It's about using the paint to quickly capture a fleeting moment of light and atmosphere.
Finally, the document brings us to Post-Impressionism, where the image is broken down even further into very specific, almost scientific visual philosophies. It highlights pointillism, where artists build entire scenes out of thousands of tiny, distinct dots of pure color that actually blend in the viewer's eye, alongside synthesism, which focused on flat areas of bold color and strong, heavy outlines.
We have traced an absolutely incredible timeline today, and to think, it's all contained on a single sheet of paper. We started with the raw, messy basics of observation, navigated the precise control of pen and ink, embraced some wildly experimental abstract styles, and finally decoded complex historical painting movements. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Looking at this master toolkit, from those dusty graphite value studies all the way to the optical illusions of oil pointillism, which part of this journey are you inspired to explore first?